Christian media had a very unique role in my life. I only went to church a handful of times, but for the majority of my life, I went to church by watching the TV. My church was aired on this network, and that's how I went to church and learned the Bible.
My experience with media restriction was inconsistent and unpredictable. Anything my dad deemed trash was out. Science fiction of all forms, anything to do with space, evolution, or progressive ideas. Nature documentaries were kind of hit and miss. Country music and shoot-'em-up westerns, however, were my dad's favorites. Plenty of references to God, in spite of the rampant sexism, racism, and violence.
Welcome to Forsaking Faith, where we tackle these and other thoughts through discussion and contemplation.
This is Heather Bailey and Christine Goodrich. Our podcast explores the journey from fundamentalist Christianity to non-belief by examining the deep and nuanced effects of deconversion.
While some ex-Christians focus on the negative aspects of their past, we want to emphasize how leaving Christianity is a complicated process that brings both pain and joy. It is both loss and liberation. While we lose structure, community, and stability, we gain empowerment and agency.
We want to create a space for thoughtful discussion in this spirit, and we invite you all to join us.
In this episode, Heather and I talk about the kind of restrictions we had when we were kids regarding television, music, and movies, and what sort of role that played later in life in terms of how we knew how to interact with media, especially secular media. And we specifically talk about how the rules were kind of arbitrary and really hard to follow, and we couldn't really monitor ourselves when we were Christians because it was difficult to see. It was more of a gut feeling than an actual set of well-defined rules that stopped us from consuming certain media. So when I was a kid, my mom was relatively strict about kind of media we consumed. Yeah, so all of the cartoons I watched as a kid, well, not all of them, but most of them were Christian cartoons. I remember The Greatest Adventure, where these group of archaeologists would fall in a hole and then experience a piece of the Bible. And that was, my main consumption. And then there were also some other cute Bible stories. Oh, I remember there was one Bible story that I can't recall the name of, but it was where I knew all of the 66 books of the Bible from. There was this song.
66 books in the whole Bible, each one a special part. But I learned this song and it didn't take long till I knew them all by heart. All 66 books by heart.
That they had where you memorized all the books of the Bible because that's the most important thing. I wonder how hard it is to find scripture. I guess you really had to study back in the day because that's a big book. I mean, to reference things and to go through them.
Yeah, and they were, obviously manuscripts from all different time periods and by different authors. And some of them are in scroll form and some of them are...
it's insane.
Depending on, yeah. So, but yes.
Anyway.
You can buy a contemporary edition that has a preface and...
Sure. A preface to the Bible.
Preface, introductory material, all the...
Oh my goodness. I didn't even realize that the Bible had a preface. So I wasn't allowed to watch movies or television shows that weren't really biblically inclined. I mean, some things I could, like Looney Tunes I watched, but even then it was really minimal. And that was when I was really little. As I got older, we got more freedom in terms of the television, so I watched more television just because my mom wasn't paying that much attention to what I was doing. Then there was another cartoon when I was little. It was where this lion would tell Bible stories to a lamb. So it was really unique. Movies that I watched, or most of the movies that I watched, were all Bible stories, actual story, like Jesus of Nazareth, which kind of goes through the New Testament, or at least the part that Jesus is in. And then King of Kings, which also does the same thing. 10 Commandments.
Let my people go.
which isn't at all accurate. I mean, there's really a lot that you can pull away from that movie that wouldn't. I mean, if you kept all the biblically accurate stuff in there, it might not be very long.
Yeah, but there's some sexiness.
Yeah,
I'm actually
right. There
surprised.
is some.
I think we weren't even allowed to watch that movie because of the sexiness in it.
Yeah, I don't know. Elizabeth Taylor, man.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I actually grew up really liking Elizabeth Taylor because of that movie, Cleopatra. So, but yeah, I mean, my mom actually didn't shield us from the sexual aspect of things. It wasn't anything that was too PG-13, I guess. And I know Heather had the same experience or a similar experience as me.
Yeah, so I also mostly only watched Christian Bible related TV shows and movies. We didn't even have a color TV in our house when I was really young, and didn't have cable at all for the most part. And this was partly to do with the fact that we didn't have a lot of money, but also, my parents were just very proud of the fact that we were not consuming secular media. So we mostly just watched movies, and this would have been on, movies on VHS in this time when I was young, because I'm very old. And so we also watched The Greatest Adventure, like Christine had mentioned, and we also watched VeggieTales a lot. So, and I'll just describe this for people who don't know what this is. VeggieTales are a film series that involves talking vegetables.
If you like to talk to tomatoes, if a squash can make you smile.
It's basically a cartoon for kids with Christian stories and Christian messages. Some of the stories are Bible stories, but with vegetables, and some of them are like contemporary stories, but related to biblical messages. So, and it used 3D animation, so it was very cutting edge. I mean, from an artistic perspective, it was really, really on trend at that time. I mean, this is right at the time when Disney Pixar is becoming a thing, when like Toy Story came out originally. So they were very smart, like from a artistic and from a business model perspective. So anyway, so we watched a lot of those. Like Christine had mentioned this too. I just missed out on a lot of the trendy shows that were happening in the 90s. So I was a kid in the 90s, but when I talk to my friends, they talk about these moments in pop culture that I just wasn't a part of. So I never watched The Simpsons. I never watched MTV. This is the cultural moment when MTV is really huge. And anyway, so there's a lot of sort of iconic things that people of our generation all kind of have this collective memory of that I don't, and have had to kind of learn about.
That sucks. Yeah. Those were like older too. Those are like when we were in high school, because I didn't have that issue.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, right. Even up through high school, I was really pretty sheltered. I remember watching American Idol with my family when that was really big, but that was one of the few things on TV that, and I did listen to Britney Spears and, NSYNC a little bit, but,
okay.
But that was when I was in high school. So now I'm skipping a little bit ahead from when I was really young, but even still, I mean, it was Britney Spears, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, and that was it. I mean, anything else that I listened to was Christian music, and we'll talk more about that in a minute about music. But anyway, so yeah. In terms of TV shows, I was kind of out of it.
It's funny. I don't think that my mother had a real idea about what we could and couldn't watch. She just would be watching something with us and maybe like turn it off if it got too violent. I mean, we really didn't have cable when I was little. So, I mean, I did get to watch things like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and I think she thought Sesame Street had some evil characters, which is so weird. We never watched Sesame Street. The Count. That's right. She hated the Count.
Okay, yeah.
Because he was like a vampire puppet. I'm like, Mommy, counts. Seriously, now I'm like, he's a vampire puppet that doesn't suck blood. Right. He just counts. It's like, give him a break. So that's why we weren't allowed to watch Sesame Street. And now, looking back at it now, I'm just, I mean, does she think, I wonder if my mother was thinking that Satan was working through the Count, and it's actually not that far-fetched to think that my mom would think that. because of the strictness of what she thought like God worked through and Satan worked through. It was a lot of Satan working through things. My mom didn't really think about God working through things, which is why we got some leeway when it came to some of the media that we consumed. So, for example, my mom listened to Jethro Tull, who is a non-Christian artist. And then she also had some influences from when she was a kid in the 60s and 70s. So she listened to some older music too, which was kind of consistent with how our church, well, sort of consistent with how our church thought. A lot of people in our church didn't think secular music was good at all, but our pastor listened to the Beatles and would talk about the songs frequently, and most of his family did, except for his daughter, who was the leader of the dance team. It wasn't until later when we were in high school, but she was just really convicted by not listening to Christian music. Do you remember this, Heather?
Yes, I did.
And I remember we used to have like 2-hour dance practices for Sunday. And I remember we spent a big chunk of time talking about the conviction of listening to secular music. And I wasn't listening to secular music too much, but I can't lie, I did have an Alanis Morissette CD. It was Jagged Little Pill, of all things, right? And I also had, one of the CDs that I bought was Plum, who is actually like half Christian and half not Christian. And most of what she sings is like subtly Christian. And so we were sort of allowed to listen to things that reached the outer edges of that genre. And so I was always listening to the ones that were on the outskirts, like Lifehouse and Plum and Switchfoot, right? I remember we went to Excel one year, and the band was so hard rock that our entire youth group walked out of the band. And this is at a Christian event, but it was just too like demonic that most of us were like saying, oh, I felt so uncomfortable. I felt like it was just definitely based on the feelings that we had that we left. When really, if we were secular, we'd just be like, well, that was really bad.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So to add, because I had a similar experience, and I do remember that moment. Yeah. From Excel. It's interesting. I think for my parents, especially, but it seems like this was also true to some extent, maybe with the Christians in our life, outside of our families too. So certainly it does seem like there's an association with sound and demonic influences, which is really interesting. And obviously now that as an adult and I'm thinking about this critically, I can see all of the ways in which it's deeply rooted in some problematic stereotyping. So like for my parents, anything that sounded urban, right? And obviously urban, it's in and of itself is like a racially coded term when people talk about something being urban. So my parents were like, oh, rap, hip hop, anything associated with someone who was non-white. Of course, my parents didn't say that. What they said was, this is bad music that's not Christian.
Are you telling me you couldn't listen to DC Talk?
Yeah, no, I was not allowed to listen. Yeah, my parents didn't like that. But I could listen to, this is why I could listen to Britney Spears. So they weren't even necessarily paying attention to the content. It was like the sound. So something that was upbeat and poppy sounding was, they thought, like going to be more wholesome than something that was either like, again, urban sounding or like heavy metal sounding, because I think
that's appalling.
Yeah, I know.
I had no idea.
Oh yeah, no, totally. And I mean, and a lot of people, not even, this isn't just a Christian problem. Like a lot of taste is so rooted in racial stereotyping in like really subtle ways. So I've heard even non-Christians say things like, yeah, like, oh, hip hop is just like shitty quality music. And I'm like, yeah, no, what you're like, what you're actually saying, that's actually very much rooted in like an idea that like a white aesthetic, like a white music sound is somehow superior in quality to, sound that's coming from artists of color. So anyway, certainly I'm not saying that's true for everyone, but for my parents, that is definitely true. Like it was definitely rooted in some deep rooted, biases about, people of color. So I remember being uncomfortable because Youth for Christ conference that we went to, they did have some Christian rap groups, I remember. And I was like really uncomfortable. I was like really scandalized, because I was like, oh, because again, I was just thinking about sound, rather than content. So anyway.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. It's actually really interesting. I didn't know that about you. And yeah, I mean, I didn't really have the strictness that was there with movies and television was not there for me with music as much. I mean, granted, my mom probably wouldn't have let me bring certain things in the house, but by the time I could buy a CD, by the time I was 15 or 16, because before that I didn't have a job and my family is poor, so I didn't have control over the music I listened to anyway. A lot of it was just praise music, what I was exposed to at church, and things like that my mom liked, like Carmen, who sings a song, Satan Bite the Dust. But we went to a few concerts when he was at Oral Roberts University, because that's where my mother went to school for evangelism. And so we did get to see some of the music there. And, I actually appreciated a lot of that. I remember on Easter down La Via della Rosa, it's a really beautiful, rich song. And
Christine and I both feel like we, don't have a lot of knowledge of music. And when I say knowledge of music, I mean just understanding genres and understanding major influences. And again, this isn't just because we were Christians. It's particularly because of how strict our parents were. We do have I have, for example, a friend who listens to this podcast regularly who's still a Christian, but he's really knowledgeable about music. But that's because he's a musician. So he was also like in these other spaces where he was playing and listening to other things. But because of our background, we didn't really get that. So I have secular friends now, friends who were raised in a secular household who can just have really intelligent conversations about music. They can, listen to a song that's playing right now and identify 3 of the influences on this person. There's a lot of terminology, like how are we characterizing this sound? And I'm getting better, but it's so slow because I didn't grow up with any of that knowledge. And it is frustrating. Sometimes I'm like, man, I just wish I had more of the foundational knowledge about this to be able to enter those conversations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the same thing for me or similar, at least, with books. Now, we had a really good book list, I think. I actually don't think there were really big restrictions on what we were allowed to read in English that I remember, unless you can remember any, Heather.
Oh my gosh, don't even get me started. No, I don't know. Do you want me to talk about it right now?
Okay. Please.
Sorry, guys. So again, I think most of you know this if you've been listening to our podcast. I getting a PhD in English literature, so I have a lot of opinions about it. But it's interesting that we have like slightly different perspectives on this.
Well, I just don't know. Yeah, I just don't know as much, and so when I think of it, I'm like, oh, okay. It was a lot of English literature, I guess. English, like classic books that was on our list. We didn't have like stories like Anansi or there was no, but it wasn't broadly cultural.
Right. So that's I definitely have a lot. So I understand. Yeah, Christine, I do agree that we got a lot of the classics, a lot of the basics. The other thing I want to clarify before I go on this rant is that this is not just a problem with our Christian school. This is a problem more generally with censorship. And so this is a problem still in public schools too. I don't think it's as intense, but I think it's still an issue. So we read certain classics, but it was very whitewashed. So we didn't read a lot of, there was sort of no sense of let's read texts that are written by people who don't have a Christian perspective, like literature that's promoting a non-Christian ethical perspective. So it was really restricted in that way. Okay, so Animal Farm, for example, like the way that this particular teacher explained it was just so again, heavily coded in weird political ways. Animal Farm is a critique of communism, but it's not a go-to guidebook for how you should actually think about politics in the real world, and that's how it was presented to us. So that's the difference. Yes, Animal Farm is a satire, and yes, it is satirizing first of all a particular kind of communism, which is actually fascism, not the principles of socialism. But the way it was presented to us was, look, hey guys, look, socialism is evil. Like, look at this book.
Yeah, that is true.
So there was a lot of that. Yeah. And then there's other things that, again, as a lit scholar, I just find, like, now, of course, at the time I didn't know any better, but now, like, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is infuriating. And so part of this was our curriculum too. It was like really, really conservative. It was called a Becca curriculum. And so, like, I just remember there was this whole thing about how terrible James Joyce is. James Joyce is like one of the most important writers of the 20th century, and he's brilliant. And also, I don't know, I mean, yeah, there is certainly subversive sexual stuff in his work, but again, so it's like we got an appreciation of literature, but without appreciating any of the subversiveness, which is what makes so much of literature good. So the reason why I get frustrated with our lit education is that we didn't get any of the pleasure of appreciating a core part of good literature, which is ambiguity. Anything that you read that is good literature is going to be complicated. That's the one that comes to my mind, but there was a lot of that. So just a lot of, like, you can only read text by authors that have some sort of, at least according to the interpretation of our teachers, some sort of clear ethical message, even though that wasn't even always accurate anyway.
No, yeah, that wasn't. Yeah, I don't think everything. I
get really fired up.
So that's okay. I found that too, but I also wasn't really monitored in high school in terms of what I read, and so I went to the library a lot, and I would read. You're hungry? Okay, give me a second. Okay, go back in there, and I will get you food. Can you give me a second? No, give me a second. Okay. Yeah. So a lot of what I read was from the library, and the science fiction books were on the bottom floor, the first hallway of the library, and very easily accessible. And so, so I would bring home books like The Guy Webster and The Jigsaw Woman, which were filled with sex, like they were dripping in sex. The Jigsaw Woman was about this woman who was sewn together sort of like a Frankenstein, except she was beautiful. And the exploration of each of her parts was what the book was, really, and who she was. And so many of that. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about legs and the story of legs. Like, sort of got to get the other stuff in there too, you know. And so a lot of, you know, my influences later on about literature didn't come from school. They came from what I read. Now that I've deconverted, it's kind of nice to not have those stresses, but I don't find myself reaching for the less Christian books for any reason. You know what I mean? Except I do really want to read Nightwood. Have you read it?
No, I haven't, but I've heard good things. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's my next classic.
Ooh, cool. Yeah. I did that exploration too. I did it much later than you because of my deconversion. And of course now, I am reading. I've read a lot more, obviously, because of my degree, but it just took me much later. And so, I remember going to the library too. And it's funny, we went to that same little library. So I remember that sci-fi section, and I remember that my mom was like, really, like, no, you can't, there's bad stuff in that section. So what's interesting about sci-fi is that Christine and I both had some sort of strange double standards. And I think especially for me, because I wasn't even allowed to explore in the science fiction section, but we were allowed to read. So I was allowed to read Lord of the Rings and watch, Lord of the Rings, and Chronicles of Narnia, and also Star Wars, and Star Trek. So there was just there were like certain sci-fi fantasy that involved magic and not always Christian, like Star Wars is not a Christian religion, and that was okay. But then Harry Potter was like totally off limits. for me, as was basically anything else that was science fiction or fantasy. And so my parents had, according to them, it was like, well, Harry Potter's bad because it's promoting witchcraft and magic that isn't rooted in God's power, but neither is Star Wars, neither is Star Trek, neither is Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is written by a Christian, but it's not none of the magic and the powers are not Christian. They're really rooted in classical mythology and the medieval romance tradition. There's a long history of intersecting Christian and pagan mythologies in medieval literature. So there's a strain of Christian influence, but then there's also a heavy pagan and influence as well. But because Tolkien was a Christian writer, it was okay, it's okay to read and watch Lord of the Rings. So I just had some strange, double standards. And so I didn't discover Harry Potter until I was in undergrad. And then I just devoured them. I was like, these are so good. And then I worked at a Harry Potter camp. I'm sure my parents loved that. I live in near Universal Studios, so I have been to Harry Potter World more than once now. Anyway, so I really love Harry Potter. Anyway, it's interesting because now reading Harry Potter is very similar. It's got it does have the pagan and, again, classical influences, but then it also has a lot of Christian motifs in it too. So just not in terms of writing quality, but in terms of influences, it's actually very similar, broadly speaking, to Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia. And so it's just interesting that there was such in my opinion, a double standard about what was appropriate.
Right. Oh, my mom didn't let me read C.S. Lewis or Tolkien. My mom didn't let me read anything that had any magical undertones to it. So I wasn't allowed to do any of that, which is funny because our pastor would use Lord of the Rings like an apocrypha, additional Bible book. And my mom actually had a huge issue with that because of the fact that she's like, no, you won't read them. Yeah. So because of that, I even was set apart from my Christian community because they were allowed to read. So there were some definitely weird lines, and we didn't really get to explore these boundaries on our own, and that's sort of something I want to do for my daughter. You just want to let her read and watch what she can, barring some things that will, hurt her innocence. My boyfriend, when he was growing up, his dad would read Lord of the Rings to him since he was 5. He would just read a chapter a night before he went to bed. And so we sort of have that in our rearing of our daughter. And so it's kind of nice to have someone who sees similar as I do, and he's never been a Christian. And so it's really good. I think that I still appreciate some of the Christian music, and I do definitely appreciate that I was able to keep my innocence a little bit longer than a lot of my secular friends. And so I'm happy about that. I think that's one of the good things I took from our upbringing.
I think one of the good things I took was, for me, I think my innocence was too prolonged and unrealistic because of my limited consumption. But I'm actually going to talk about that in an upcoming podcast in more detail when we talk about relationships. So I'll talk more about my consumption of Christian romance novels. But one positive thing definitely is that because we were not allowed to watch a lot on TV, we were just always outside, my sisters and I, and we were reading a lot. And sure, I have critiques of what we were reading, or what we were encouraged to read and what we weren't allowed to read. But we were reading and we were outside. 90% of my childhood was being outside playing, and that still affects me. Even today, if I can help it at all, even if I have work to do, I will take my laptop out on my balcony in my apartment and just I just want to be outside. And I've never been one of those people that can wake up and just sit in front of a TV or computer indoors all day. I would go crazy. So there's definitely some good things that come of it.
I don't spend a lot of time watching TV. We don't even have cable now. So I do think that some of my influences, like there are people who, and like you, people who know what television shows are popular. And I mean, I just watched Stranger Things, the first season, like last month. And so I'm sort of, my taste is kind of outdated all the time, including like Lost. I didn't watch until the seasons were done. There was no waiting for an episode for me. I watched the whole thing when I wanted to. And I haven't watched Game of Thrones either.
Oh, I'm kidding. I'm partially kidding. No, but it is good if you like Lord of the, Game of Thrones is like Lord of the Rings with more sex. So it's great. Go ahead. After deconversion, one thing that's changed for me is that I have gotten really into TV shows and also movies, which is like a newer thing for me. That's actually been a goal of mine for this year. And so I've gotten better at like being able to identify directors and sort of having a sense of someone's particular aesthetic. For example, I've been watching all of Sofia Coppola's films recently and just like, getting a flavor for her as a director and writer. So, so I'm getting more knowledgeable about that kind of stuff. But yeah, TV shows as well. But like Christine, it's interesting. In some ways, we're similar because... So yeah, I do think of myself as a TV show connoisseur because it's my outlet after I'm done reading, which is what I do for my job right now, is read and study and write my dissertation. So I like knowing what good, critically acclaimed TV shows are out there, and I like watching them and having opinions about them. And so I'm pretty up on the pulse. Yeah, if you were to ask me about any TV show that's got buzz right now, I can tell you about it, and I've definitely seen at least some episodes, if not all of it. I don't just have my TV on during the day, and I think that's definitely because of my influence, my background growing up. And there are people, I have friends who do this, like they wake up in the morning and the first thing they do is turn on cable television. And I've never done that.
Additionally to this, I also want to talk about this idea that my mom thought that demons worked through everything. I actually still get really scared of demonic horror movies. And some of the demonic undertones in movies kind of freak me out more. We recently watched It, the new one. And so Pennywise the clown really freaks me out. And it's silly in some ways because he's supposed to be like an alien, not even like a demon. And I had this issue when I was young too. And even... and I don't know if that's because my mom sheltered me from things like that, so I never was desensitized, or if it's because when you talk about demons, my feelings go to the idea of hell. And so I'm always thinking about torture and anguish and all of the negative, scary things that are out of your own control when you think of hell and being attacked by Satan. So for me, I haven't been able to graduate from those feelings. I still get nightmares where in my nightmare, I promise God that if he makes it stop, I'll worship him forever. And then I remember a few times I have recently plead the blood of Jesus, because my mom used to do that when something scary. She would say, just plead the blood of Jesus, plead the blood of Jesus, which I had to give a disclaimer to my friends. I was like, look, if I walk away, it's not because I'm not enjoying the film. It's because I just still can't handle this.
Yeah. So I'm really similar, and it's interesting, and we're not the only ones either who have a fundamentalist background who have experienced this. So I'm curious, maybe those of you who are listening, you should write us if you've also experienced this. But yeah, I also was terrified of demons and anything demonic. And it was like you were saying, Christine, I think it is partly to do with, for me, is an association with hell. And again, I just want to emphasize for people who are listening who don't have a Christian background, we thought, demons were not presented to us as other kinds of fantastical monsters. We believed that they were real. I mean, fundamentally in our core, the core of our being, which is why we were so scared of them. And in particular, when we were growing up, my parents had these books, like books of the Bible, of the Gospels that were dramatized, audio versions. And they thought it was a good idea to play these before we went to bed. And I get it in theory, like, oh, scripture, good. This is positive and moral and uplifting. Except that there's like a lot of creepy and strange things that happen in the Gospels if you read them all the way through and you're not just picking out like the good parts. And one of the things that is in
like the pigs.
Yeah. So there's like several demonic possession moments. Yeah. One of the most famous ones. Yeah. The pigs. There's a demon. Well, there's a guy who's possessed by many demons, and the demon says, my name is Legion, because, we're many. And Jesus is talking to him. And so Jesus exorcises the demon, and the demons go into this herd of pigs, and then all the pigs just like run off the cliff and kill themselves. I mean, that is a really like a morbid thing to listen to when you're like 3 or 4 years old trying to sleep. And what made it worse is that because it was dramatized, like they hired, voice actors to do all the parts. That whoever they hired did like this really creepy demon voice whenever a demon talked. And so anyway, it just really scared me. I used to have panic attacks all the way up through high school of just like I could not sleep because I just thought like demons were everywhere in our house and they were just like waiting to possess me. I mean, it was really, really intense. My conversion story is grounded and rooted in this kind of fear, which is, again, looking back now, really fucked up. So really, my dad wanted me to ask Jesus into my heart. And I want to emphasize that I was very young. I was like 7 years old. And so the way that he did it is he took me to this play that was another church in our town was putting on. And this play was a particular genre that is really popular in like Christian fundamentalist circles, where you basically like have a bunch of characters and they all die, these like really horrific sudden deaths. And then the play dramatizes what happens after they die. And so I remember the one that we went to, there was like one particular one where like it was a mother and daughter, and they are in a car and they get hit by like a semi-automatic truck. It's like, again, it's really morbid. And so this was dramatized. So they had, actors and all of these theatrics. And so they had an actor playing the devil, and he got really into his character. And, they had like a smoke machine, and he like went through the audience, and he was like telling everyone how much he hated them. And again, he had like full like makeup on and stuff. So it was like really scary. He's like, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. And again, I'm 7, and it was terrifying. And then after this play, my dad takes me to the park, and he's like, do you want to ask Jesus into your heart? Which, who's going to say no to that? What 7-year-old is going to be like, oh, let me think rationally about this? So of course I said yes. So anyway, it was just and this is pretty common. I mean, again, it's just very manipulative. It's a kind of brain, basically, and again, it was well intended. I don't mean to say, my dad really loves me, and my dad, from his perspective, he was like, well, I want her soul to be saved. So I get the motivation was good, but the methodology was not, a good thing. I mean, it was a kind of brainwashing, and a brainwashing that was rooted in fear, rather than, of course there's like, he talked about how much God loves me too, but after I had just witnessed like all the fear first, of like Satan.
Right. Yeah. And so I do think that Heather and I mostly are frustrated with the fact that the rules were so arbitrary, and there weren't really hard lines on what we could and could not consume. But I do think that I still appreciate a lot of the music that we listened to as kids. I like that I know a lot of the Bible stories.
Yeah, I'm not mad at my parents for having convictions. That's actually something I really admire about them. But I just think the inconsistencies with what was okay and what wasn't okay. And my parents weren't good at giving a rationale ever. It was just like, well, because we're your parents, you're not allowed to watch this. Instead of having a conversation and saying, here's the reasoning, here are the principles that we're operating under. Here's the reasoning behind why we don't want you watching this right now. So
I think that's probably common even in the secular realm, just for parents to like not think. And it is hard. It's difficult for every movie, every show, everything they're exposed to sit them down and say, okay, let's talk about the good and the bad, instead of just like, okay, enjoy it, and maybe I think more importantly, that is one way to assert your values, right? To limit media. But I think more importantly for me, it's the actions that you have and the way that you treat people that will send that message. And I think that's true in the Christian church as well. Like if my mom had, allowed me to read Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis and just asserted that there is an understanding that we don't want to allow negative influences into our life, then maybe, I don't know, maybe it would be better, but I don't know. I also kind of appreciate my mom's convictions and how strongly she stuck to things. So I don't know, maybe it's something you do kind of have to grow into, especially when you have a Christian upbringing.
Yeah. And figuring out, and we've talked about this before in a previous podcast, that we don't want to just reject all conviction. We just have to develop our own and figure out what that line is. Yeah. So I also admire my parents, for standing up and staying true to their particular convictions.
We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. We would like to thank our Twitter friends Amanda Kirby and Matt Clark, who provided us with the reflections that you heard at the beginning of the podcast, and specifically to Matt Clark, who pulled out his guitar and vocal cords for the song you hear at the end. And we also would like to extend a huge thank you to all of you, our listeners. We're truly grateful for your support.
If you would like to contact us, you may email us. Our email address is forsakingfaith@gmail.com. You can also tweet us at Forsaking Faith or like our Facebook page, which is called Forsaking Faith. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, and we would also appreciate it if you would leave us a review so that more people can find us. Stay tuned as we wrap up this episode with our artistic segment, which we hope will further inspire you as you reflect on what you've just heard. Today, Christine will be reading one of her original poems.
All right. Haven't played in a while. Haven't sang in a while, but we're going to try this anyways. This song is called Candle, and it is about losing something that you love, whether it be religion or someone close to you. Here we go. My night took the darkness from my sight. The candle, don't stay lit for long. The flame, it burnt away all my troubles and the pain. It kept me warm, it kept me safe. But now all that's left is the smoke of what is dead, and it is cold and it is dark now. It's odd to see such hope just quickly burn away without a chance of rekindling the flames. A beacon so bright, I thought you were my guiding light. Then I find you never shine for me, so I'm lost right now, because I cannot see. Could anyone light a spark for me? But this day is not for you, so we must feel our way through till we find something better to burn. And I'll keep the thought of life tucked inside my mind, so I know it if it shines my way again. And I'll accept and know the fire isn't dead, it's just burning somewhere else instead. And though I want, and though I need its warmth, the flame can't be controlled, of course. So keep your candle burning, if even not for me. And I will love your light, for which I'll never see. Thank you.